Welcome to the Building PA Podcast, the voice of the construction industry throughout Pennsylvania. Here are your co-hosts, Chris Martin and John O'Brien.
Hello, and welcome to the Building PA Podcast. I am co-host John O'Brien, coming to you from Central Pennsylvania, joined as always by podcast all-star, podcast superstar. You know him, you love him. Put your hands together for Chris Martin, everyone.
Well, John, again, you always set me up so high, and it's just great. I truly just love doing podcasts with you. It's great. It's a good friendship, and here we are. But we're moving forward with some great topics today. But hey, everyone, I am Chris Martin, president of Atlas Marketing, and we tell stories for companies who build things, or that build things, I should say. But we have a topic regarding something that's so important to the construction industry in Pennsylvania. And admittedly, I'm going to put words in John's mouth, but he's kind of become somewhat of an expert on this. The topic is the Separations Act, which we're going to dive into a little bit more. But before we do that, we also want to state, we're not taking a political side on this issue. We're going to talk about the history. So we know that some of our listeners are for this Separations Act and some are against it. We're not getting into that. We're just going to simply talk about what the Separations Act is and what it means for the construction industry in Pennsylvania. So, John, let's start off with telling us, what is the Separations Act and why should we care?
Absolutely. Good question. So the Separations Act is a public procurement act that covers vertical construction. So a school building, for instance. And it was enacted over a century ago, and it requires that the public sector, so a school building or at the state level, state and local level, not federal projects, but public construction projects must hire at least 4 separate prime contractors. And they're actually named in the act. They have the general trades, electrical, HVAC, and plumbing. So those are the 4 contractors that must be. You could expand beyond that and have more than 4, but you have to have at least 4 prime contractors in Pennsylvania. And there's arguments for, arguments against. There's plenty of podcasts on this topic. There's plenty of articles on this topic. There's been plenty of committee hearings and testimony on this topic. And like Chris said, we're not taking a stance. We're just going to talk about the history of the act today. But by all means, if you want to follow up and talk more about the act and get specifics and get stances and find out which groups are for it, which groups are against it, feel free to follow up. Like Chris said, I've been at this issue a very, very long time. It kind of reminds me of Thomas Jefferson, the great mind Thomas Jefferson. He said, when I die on my tombstone, I don't want it to say U.S. President. I don't want it to say anything about the Constitution. I don't want anything. I just want it to say founder of University of Virginia. So when I die, I don't want anything on my tombstone that says Separations Act expert. I don't want anything like that. Maybe like dad, nothing. Good guy, something like that. But nothing related to the Separations Act on my tombstone, please.
That's fair. As your friend, we'll make that happen. I promise.
Okay,
but that's going to be for a long, long time. So, so let me get again. You and I've talked about the Separations Act so long for a long time. I think actually one of the very first conversations we had was, hey, here's what this is, and let's talk about how we can kind of raise the awareness of this. Right? That was oh my God, that was probably 10 or 15 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But what I've always been amazed by is the push to have 4 different contractors on a project. Can you explain why that is? And again, we're not taking sides, but to me, that just seems like we're forcing something to be there that is kind of unnecessary.
Yeah. So like you said, I've been at this issue a long time, and I actually drafted an article on the founding of this because I'm a history guy myself, so I like to look into history and find out why things happened the way they did, and just learn. I've learned so much over the years studying this issue. It was enacted May 1st, 1913. And where I used to work at the Master Builders Association, they had a landmark anniversary, 10 plus years ago. And I was going back through meeting minutes in 1915, 2 years after this was enacted. And in board meetings, they said we should get groups of members together to go to Harrisburg to try and repeal the Separations Act. So there was efforts to repeal it all the way back to 1915. It was the earliest.
Literally the moment it was signed, like,
yes.
Hey, we don't even think this is smart. Like, let's go.
Yeah,
wow.
There's that. I mean, it's a unique issue in that both political parties have taken the lead to modernize it, to change it, to repeal it. It kind of goes back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans over the past 100 years. I mean, someone like Governor Rendell was the biggest supporter to change it. He was always pushing to change this act. Thornburg was the same way. Republican Governor Thornburg talked many times about it and the need to change it. So in that aspect, I don't know other issues like this that kind of go back and forth between the parties.
Yeah,
it's unique in that aspect.
Well, and it's interesting because you said that this act has been around for 112 years. Obviously, believe it or not, construction has changed a lot in that time. But also, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, that. But also, business has changed, right? And so, how the evolution of this, like, do you know how many times it has changed and how many times like almost Separations Act 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, has there been improvements or modifications to this over that time?
Not really. I mean, when it was first enacted, it was any project over $4,000. So this was back in 1913. That was, oh no, I'm sorry, excuse me. It was $500. That was the original threshold. And that has changed over the years, I believe, in the late 80s, I believe, or no, I'm sorry, late 70s. They raised the threshold to 4,000 for all construction. And sometime in the 90s, they raised that to 25,000 just for education, K through 12 projects. Probably the biggest impactful change was 1966, 67 or so, I believe. The township code changed to replace the word shall with may. So it used to say for township projects, they shall follow the Separations Act. They changed it to they may follow the Separations Act. So it was a way for them to decide at that level, do we want multiple prime contractors or do we want single prime contractor? And because they didn't drastically change it or repeal it, still to this day, there's lots of confusion when there's projects, because every once in a while you'll hear of a project that goes single prime and they're like, how did that happen? And they said, well, they changed it back in the 60s to may instead of shall. And there's some that say that's legal. There's attorneys that say it's not. So it's very confusing. Another major legislative change was Governor Ridge in 2000 enacted the Education Empowerment Act. And this was an act from 2000 to 2010 that allowed the public sector K through 12 construction projects to waive various mandates that are required to the educational sector. And of the list of 40 or so waivers, Separations Act was the most popular waiver. There was over 70 school districts that requested a waiver of the Separations Act. And that allowed the schools to use any delivery system they wanted during that 10-year window. It was extremely popular.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's interesting because during that time frame, there was such a boom in education projects, across the state. So that's actually, I never realized that, like the impact on that. So that's kind of cool from a historical standpoint.
Yeah, there was a lot of projects. So a school could get it, like North Hills. I was living North Hills at the time, North Hills School District, just 10 miles north of the city of Pittsburgh, and they got the waiver. They had a couple projects. So one waiver covered, I believe, two projects.
Yeah.
Grove City High School out there, Butler High School, Shaler, all these school districts out there, got the waiver and
Yeah.
did some good stuff with it, and saved some tax
Right.
dollars.
Right.
Another change was Governor Rendell. He enacted the Property Tax Act, and in it they launched a task force. It was called the School Cost Reduction Task Force, and it was a committee of, I believe, 15 individuals from across the state. The Master Builders Association's president at the time was Joe Burchick. He's the owner of Burchick Construction. He was one of the 15 people appointed to serve on that committee, and I was his alternate member representing him on the committee. And as busy as he is, running his construction company, he made it to only one meeting. I went to every meeting. Sometimes there were multiple meetings a month. And that task force overwhelmingly supported a need to modernize the Separations Act. So There's been a lot of task force like that over the years. That's the only one I was directly involved with.
Okay. Well, John, you also mentioned earlier you've written an article.
Yeah.
And I know you had mentioned that you wanted to kind of read some elements of that. So fire away, man. Let's hear what you have. And I'm assuming that article is posted somewhere that we could share in the description. But just for that record, fire away.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I like history. So here's my research, and I like writing. So here's my historical research. I penned a little article here. So here it goes. This is the story of the Separations Act, enacted May 1st, 1913, by John O'Brien. This story begins in 1883 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. With an 8th grade education coupled with a handful of self-taught educational years, Joseph Huston started working for an architectural firm named Furnace and Sons. After a few years working at this firm, Huston enrolls at Princeton University, where he was an honors student, and upon graduation, he returns to Philadelphia to continue working for Furnace and Sons. At Furnace and Sons, Houston worked on some marquee buildings like the Pennsylvania Railroad Broad Street Station, which stood until 1953, and where Penn Center in Philadelphia's Central Business District now stands. After a few years at the firm and designing some notable projects, Huston decides to start his own firm. In 1898, Huston and his older brother set off to see the great art in architecture in Europe. His brother encounters some major health issues, which nearly takes his life. While his brother was recuperating in Europe, Houston takes advantage of his time in Europe with his sketchbook to capture inspirational sights. And after seeing and drawing St. Peter's Basilica, he wrote, "One day I hope to build a building as grand." In 1901, Houston had the opportunity to design a grand building and entered Pennsylvania's Capitol Building Design Competition. He was considered a long shot due to his youth and design inexperience compared to the others competing in this contest. But he was chosen the winner. Houston intended to make the Pennsylvania Capitol a monument to the new Renaissance. He succeeded, and October 4th, 1906, the Capitol's dedication ceremony, President Theodore Roosevelt was caught saying as he entered, "This is the handsomest state capitol I ever saw." While it was a magnificent building, the project was way over budget, 3 times more than the legislature allocated. Shortly after the state capitol's opening, William Berry is elected to serve a 2-year term to the state treasury. It's noteworthy to point out that Berry was the only Democrat from 1893 to 1931 to be elected for a statewide position. He was very popular. Due to the rumblings about the state capitol project way over budget, Berry decides to start digging around. Berry and his team discover that there had been no oversight. which led to the state capitol project to be $7.7 million over budget. This was in 1913, which is equivalent to $211 million. That was the amount. That's the amount when this article was written. That's probably more now. While this alarming audit report to the state capitol project is being discussed, a former Major League Baseball player, John Tenor, is elected to serve in the U.S. Congress. His name will surface again shortly. Hang on. In 1910, 4 years after the state capitol dedication ceremony, the legal system finally ran its course, and the work of Barry and his team provided enough damaging facts to convict guilty parties for their unscrupulous actions. The self-taught Princeton grad Houston is sentenced to 2 years in prison for grafting. Joining Houston with prison sentences are general contractor John Sanderson, state auditor William Snyder, and the person Barry replaced as state treasurer, William Matthews. With little financial stewardship, each convicted individual profited tremendously. But this sort of illegal activity wasn't just happening at this project. It was the norm on public construction projects at this time. Public contracting corruption was running rampant at this time, but it was Barry who shined the light on the biggest story of fraud back in the early 1900s. Because of this story, Barry was receiving a lot of attention throughout Pennsylvania. He decided to parlay this media attention into a run for governor. However, he lost in the primary and could not run as a Democrat, so he decides to run as an independent. The Republicans knew that Barry was a force to be reckoned with, even as an independent. So the GOP reached out to the popular U.S. Congressman Tenor, who initially wanted to remain in Congress, and he did not want to run for governor. But he was later convinced to make that run. In his bid for governor, Barry plays up contracting corruption and how he is the person who can clean it up. On the campaign trail, there's lots of talks about the state capitol project and Barry's role in bringing out the truth. This picks up traction with a lot of portion of the population. So much so that Barry, as an independent, almost pulls off the biggest upset in a governor's race. Yet the popular former Major League Baseball player turned congressman, Tenor, ends up winning and becoming the 25th governor in 1911. He ended with 43% of the vote. William Barry finished with 38% of the vote, and the Democrat on the ballot, State Senator Webster Grimm, finished with 13. Due to all the attention that Barry showed to corruption in public contracting, this issue was not going away anytime soon, and others in the legislature and media kept this issue alive. With the state capitol project still being talked about, the idea surfaces that companies on a project can monitor each other if there are multiple primes. Unlike the state capitol, whereas there was just a few sets of eyes on the contract: the architect, the GC, and the public owner. With the outrage of this issue staying alive and public support growing to address it, something had to be done. On May 1st, 1913, Governor Tenor signs the Separation Act, mandating multiple prime contractors on public construction projects. Perhaps in 1913, enacting the Separations Act made sense due to the circumstances. But in this day and age, and every cent can be easily tracked, does it still make sense? Question mark. Boom, that's it.
That's it. First off, John, I got to hand it to you. You're a really good writer. Second of all, like hearing the story and listening to it, like I'm literally like, okay, did he do this? Is this the reason that this is here? And then it's just fascinating. Now every time I drive past the Capitol in Harrisburg, I'm going to go like, there's a big reason for this, right? That's just a really fascinating story from the standpoint of how construction not only has changed, but how it was a challenge, really. I mean, like from a perspective of not only getting the project built, but also the cost and the delivery methods now. I mean, you hear so much about delivery method and how it's changed so much, Do you think that, and I'm getting to my question now, do you think that the Separations Act was kind of like an impetus for all of these different delivery methods that we have now today?
I think the way it's run now, it could highlight a need for benefits of other systems. Like I'm thinking
Okay.
of like design build or construction management at risk. There's so many benefits during pre-con where you can get the construction team to provide input on the site work, on the mechanical systems, on the whole overall building. Whereas now it's like we're going to design in the silo and then construction's in a silo and there's not as much collaboration. So I think it really highlights, and that's really evident when I talk to colleges and I talk to students and they intern and they intern at a place that does public projects and they said this isn't what they teach us in college. This is kind of unique the way they said there's not a lot of input between construction team and design team, and I'm like, yeah, you're right, there is not a lot of input during pre-con.
Yeah, well, and to clarify too, the Separations Act it only encompasses public funded projects in the state of Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
At the state and local. So the
At the
federal
state and
government
local level.
doesn't require this, correct? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So like commercial projects, like a corporation wants to build a 3-foot or 3-story building, they don't fall under the Separations Act. Okay.
Correct.
Again, just to clarify, because we're not looking at this from a political perspective.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is what you just said too, is one, this legislation or this piece of legislation isn't being taught in the schools. And so what's the impact then on young construction project managers or project executives or even people in the field? Like, whoa, what does this mean for me? Like, wait, this is something I gotta handle and understand, right? So what do you see as the impact there?
It's definitely a learning curve. It's the funniest story to that is Mansfield University hired an individual on the construction team. I think he came from Tennessee, and I was making the rounds, calling some of the schools and just saying, hey, we're trying to address the Separations Act. What are your thoughts, whatever? And the individual from Mansfield's like, I didn't know about this before I started here, but this is ridiculous what's going on. I can't believe people build like this, whatever. So it's really mind-boggling when people see it after not experiencing this or not, being in school and not talking about this, and then you're thrown to the wolves, and there's not one person steering the ship. There's 4 different people, and Slowest Link turns them down. But I don't want to turn this into a political thing, so I feel like I'm talking about why we need to modernize it.
That was a good shift there, man.
Yes.
So that leads me to my next question. What is the next step? Like, what do we do? How can we in Pennsylvania? Obviously, call your legislators and talk and call a KCA and talk to them and go that route. But what can be done to really make this a little bit more modernized or even improved upon? Go from there.
Yeah, I mean, at KCA, we've taken the educational aspect, because for years it was like, this law exists, it should not exist, we want you to change it. Now it's like, there's legislators that never really were educated on it. Let's fully explain why. So when we're meeting in their office and say, you're sitting in a building and why the act was enacted, you're sitting in the Capitol building. Let me tell you the story about that. And not only talk about what currently happens in the public sector, but compare that to the private sector and talk about the differences and how we can be more efficient. So I'd say just focus on education and awareness. Every 2 years, House members are up for election, and seems like there's 20 plus new legislators every year. So that's 20 people that you say, what's your stance on the Separations Act? And their response is this about religion? Like, what are you asking me? I don't know what's going on here. So we just constantly raise awareness and improve education.
Yeah.
And people that support the status quo, it's good to speak with them too. My door is always open, and I invite them to these meetings too. So state your case. Why should this law stay in the books?
Right. Well, another question that comes to my mind too is this a reason that a lot of contractors and even to that point design firms and other folks stay away from more of these public projects?
Yes, absolutely. And from large mechanical contractors tell me that they said this is too much of a hassle. There's general contractors. They're called the private ones. If I'm in Harrisburg and lobbyists and contractors that support the status quo, their typical line to me is, you represent the private guys, the guy who builds the hospital, the company that builds the educational buildings. Your members don't even work in this area, and I'm like, well, that's why they don't work in this area. So I have to explain that. And the best story I have related to that topic is, there's a company in Pittsburgh. It's called Gendico Construction, and its founder, Pete Dozy, his son Dom now runs it, Dom Dozy, Dom and Mike Kuhn. But the founder, Pete Dozy, I was sitting down with him after he retired, and he was pulling out scrapbooks, and he's showing me all these projects he's proud of. And I'm looking at their work in the 60s and 70s. And I see all these high schools. I see like North Allegheny High School, Plum High School, all these different high schools that they built. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, Pete, it looks like all you did was public work back in the day. And he said, yes, that was us. That's what we were all about. And I'm like, now you don't do any public work. You don't even look at it. Don't even consider it. You're just on St. Vincent campus. You're on CMU, UPMC, Allegheny Health. You do just private work. That's quite a change. Like, what happened? And he looks at me and says, the mid 1990s, it was just an overnight boom of construction attorneys. They just popped up everywhere. It was up until the mid 90s. If we had an issue on a project, we'd call the electrical contractor. We'd call hey, you're slowing us down, or hey, this week I'm doing this. We'd swap schedules. We'd work out issues. Everything was buddy. We grew up together, worked on projects together. And then with this influx and just this taking over of all the construction attorneys, suddenly you make that call to your buddy and you get a call back from the attorney saying, you have to document this, you have to put this in writing, and my client didn't bid to that. And he said it just got to be too much. It was paying our attorney just so I can call my friend I've known for 40 years. Crazy.
And that's just not the construction industry. I can tell you that's in advertising, marketing, everything. So, but hey, what are you going to do? That's a topic for another episode, right?
It is.
Hey, John, I think this has been a great conversation, and I know we're going to be talking about some of this more. I encourage our listeners, visit the KCA website if you want to know more about the Separations Act. Talk with John and his team at the KCA about what how to get involved with modernizing this bill or not bill, the law. But thanks for bringing this up. I think this is a great topic, and it's something that we all in the industry need to just keep our eye on, especially in Pennsylvania. And we go from there. So thank you.
You bet. And this is the Building PA podcast, so it's open to all construction. If any supporters of the status quo want to come on, that door is always open. I've offered a few, and no one ever responds. So hopefully someone responds.
Yeah, we'd love to hear. Tell us why this is a good thing. Tell us, or tell us why it should. How do we modernize it? How do we do that? So you're right. Let's use this as a forum to talk about it. I like that. Cool. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for joining the Building PA podcast. To stay up to date, follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, and visit buildingpapodcast.com to subscribe to upcoming shows. Thanks for listening.